Hi, and welcome to Tom Kennedy Science, and I'm your host, Dr. Tom Kennedy. So this is my first lecture for a class that I teach called Plant Form and Function. Actually, it's Plant and Animal Form and Function, but we almost always do the plant part first. So, what's a better way to start a class on plant form and function than talking about what is a plant? Now, right here, I've got two different organisms. One is a plant, one is not. I know, they both kind of look like plants. They both are photosynthetic, but what makes one a plant? What makes one not a plant? Well, to know this, to understand that, we need to know the defining characters of a plant. Now, this is slightly different than asking the question, what do all plants have in common? Because, well, they're all eukaryotic cells and they all carry out photosynthesis. Well, this organism on the right, did I just give it away? It's not a plant, even though it's made up of many cells and is photosynthetic. A defining character is a set of characters that is unique to a group of organisms that separate them out from everything else, right? So they're unique and they're shared in that lineage because they acquired them from common ancestry. Remember those evolution lessons? So I kind of already gave it away here. Yeah, that's an algae. So here's our different types of plants. I mean, broadly speaking, right? We got bryophytes, we've got the ferns, we've got the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Wait, did I use some big words? Gymnosperms are basically your conifers, pines and junipers and cedar trees. And then your angiosperms, these are all your plants that have flowers. Now, I mean, you go anywhere from a moss, a bryophyte, right? These mosses are amongst the most ancient of all of our plants. Well, what do they have in common with a flowering plant? What does a flowering plant have in common with a fern or a conifer, like a pine tree? Well, these are the defining characters of plants. Now, one way to define a plant is that they are multicellular organisms that are autotrophic. Okay, so multicellular, multi just means many. It means they're made up of lots of different types of cells. And autotrophic means self-feeding. I'll come back to the autotrophic part here in a second. But multicellular organisms, we're just a little bit more than a colony of cells, right? Plants, animals, and fungus are all multicellular organisms. But what makes us different than just a colony of cells? And this is very important. Plants have specialized cells to form tissues, just like animals, just like a fungus. So in plants, you might have dermal tissue. So if you look at the outside of a plant, like the top of its leaf, it's made of epidermal cells and guard cells. Now, like us, our cells have all the same genes, but a liver cell expresses different genes than a muscle cell. Well, guess what? In a plant cell, a guard cell might express different genes than an epidermal cell. And you might have the ground tissue system. Oh, we're going to talk about these later. Sclerenchyma, parenchyma, and collenchyma cells. The ground system is just the main part of the plant that is doing photosynthesis or storing carbohydrates. We'll come back to that. And of course, you have a vascular system in plants. We're going to talk about that too in depth throughout this series of lectures on plants. So you've got the xylem. This transports water from the roots to the leaves. And they're made up of tracheids and vessel elements. And then you've got the phloem, which transports photosynthates, things like carbohydrates and other things the plants are making, from the leaves, or where they're originating from, to other parts of the plant, like the roots. And that's like the sieve tube elements and the companion cells. So the point here is a multicellular organism. Every cell in a tree or a plant all has the same genes. But because those cells are differentiating, they differentiate into different cell types that have different functions that form different tissues. Now, I like making comparisons to plant and animals because I think a lot of us connect a little bit better to animals than we do to plants. I personally really like plants. But like us, or like plants, however you want to look at this, tissues form organs. We have an organ, stomach, lung, liver, right? They have organs too. Leaves, flowers, roots, a vascular system. These are the organs of a plant that carry out different functions. Now, In plants, it gets a little messy sometimes, but that's okay. And like I said, these differentiated cells are creating the different tissues that come together to make the different organs of the plant. So when you look at it, this plant, the bottom one, is a moss. It has all of these different things that it does, like has differentiated cells that form tissues that form organs, whereas the algae on the top is more or less a colony of cells that doesn't have that degree of differentiation that a plant does. So there we are. And this is important here. This differentiated cells that's controlled by genetics and chemical signaling. We control our cells through chemical signaling as well. And plants, they also have hormones. And they can respond to the environment. Plants have senses too. It's one of my podcasts. So the algae is not a plant. Now, there's more to this story of the defining characters of plants. But before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about self-feeding. These are auto, which means self, troph means feeding. Interestingly, algae are also autotrophic as well, but the difference between an algae and a plant is that we're multicellular autotrophs. Not every cell in a plant is doing photosynthesis, self-feeding. It's where you've got your chloroplast. Interestingly, I know I keep using that word, they can make all the organic molecules from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, water from the ground, and a few minerals that they can pull up from the ground as well, like calcium and magnesium and some nitrogen. These are the nutrients that plants need. And they are capable of making every molecule they need. At least most plants can. And so they don't have an essential fatty acids. They don't have essential amino acids or vitamins. We have vitamins and these essential nutrients that we have to have. We can't make them. Plants, they can make every single organic molecule they need from, like I said, carbon dioxide, water, and a little bit of fertilizers and some minerals in the ground. It's quite astounding. So now in biology, there's always an exception. And in this case, believe it or not, there are carnivorous plants. And these are pitcher plants. Those are modified leaves. They hold water in them and they have little hairs that point down. And insects will fly in there, get caught, and then the plant will release some digestive enzymes and absorb the nutrients from the insects that they've captured. Pretty interesting. So biology, we are full of exceptions. What makes it interesting? But here is one of the main defining features of plants. It is called alternation of generations. And for many people, this is how we define what makes a plant a plant. And so this is very interesting. I know, I said it again. It's really interesting. Okay, plants alternate between a diploid and a haploid organism. Whoa, what? Diploid and haploid? You and I, we're diploid. All of our cells contain 2 copies of our genome. 1 copy from our mom, 1 copy from our dad. And our gametes are haploid. But our gametes are always single-celled. That's our sperm and our egg. But in plants, they can actually have a multicellular organism. This is more than just a cell, right? A multicellular organism that is haploid and another one that is diploid, right? And I'm going to use some words here. The gametophyte is haploid. Think gametes, like sperm and egg. It's haploid. And then the sporophyte is diploid. So if we were a plant, you and I'd be the sporophyte. And interestingly, the sporophyte will have cells that will undergo meiosis that will become haploid. But then those spores can actually grow into a haploid organism. It's so crazy. So, and then the sporophyte will then create haploid cells through mitosis, right? And then they will come together, and they're the gametes, and they'll come together to form a zygote, which grows into a sporophyte, which is diploid. And I will talk more about this alternation of generations later. So you got the sporophytes, which are diploid, and the gametophytes, which are haploid. And you might be thinking, well, where in the world can I see this? And interestingly, if you look at little mosses, if you go hiking in the woods and you see little green fuzzy things growing in moist areas, those are almost certainly mosses. And there's different types of mosses. Moss is kind of a generic term for three really different lineages that don't have a vascular system. And if you look at this moss here, you're actually looking at the gametophyte, the haploid part. Okay, you're looking at the part that only has one copy of the genome, and through mitosis, right, making duplicate copies, it will produce a haploid gamete that will then fuse to form the sporophyte. And interestingly, the sporophyte on these mosses is tiny. It actually grows out of the top of the gametophyte. So could you imagine, right? You're this organism, you're photosynthetic, you've got these roots, you're growing, and something grows out of you that is diploid from something you produced. I know, it's so weird. So the sporophyte actually grows from the gametophyte. The diploid part of the plant life cycle actually grows out of the gametophyte. I love that. But as plants evolved over hundreds of millions of years, there has been a general trend in the reduction in the size of the gametophyte. So what that means is if you're a moss, the gametophyte, the haploid part of the organism, of the life cycle, dominates. It lives the longest, it's the largest part. By the time we get to flowering plants that showed up back in the Cretaceous over 130 million years ago, the gametophytes are basically have been reduced to just several cells inside the pollen or inside the ovules of the flower. So they're greatly reduced. And whenever you're looking at a flowering plant or a tree, you now see the sporophyte, which is enormous and lasts a long time. And the gametophyte is actually what's tiny. So there we have it. These are the defining characters of plants that make them unique. That alternation of generations. I mean, that's what's, for a lot of botanists, that's what's key. But let's not forget that plants are also multicellular heterotrophs. And they're the only thing that's a multicellular heterotroph like that. Even though algae is multicellular, they're not quite like we are in plants because they don't have the differentiation of the cells into different tissues which form organs. And in fact, these algae, any cell can basically do any of the different functions. Okay, well, there you have it. That is the defining character of plants. Now, stay tuned for my next video because it's going to be on the evolutionary history of plants and how plants have completely transformed the earth. I know you're thinking oxygen, and you're right. You're absolutely right. But there's way, way more to this story, and I can't wait to tell it. So stay tuned. And this has been another episode of Tom Kennedy's Science.